Let's take care of the sparks layer now. So I will maybe disable the fog volume and the smoke grid for this. And also I can disable all of the lights. So we will be rendering the sparks as 100% emission. Let's step in our effects geometry and let's just grab one of the heads that is animated on the geometry. So I'll go over here to my body PRT and I'll grab all of these nodes and I will just Control C and let me just paste them maybe over here. So what we have here is simply the geometry animating along the curve. And we can actually get rid of this set emission because we will using the whole geometry to create these sparks. So I wanted the sparks to fly out from the head and we can use the normal vector and set it as our velocity. So what I will do here after this time shift is I will drop down a normal and let's make sure that our points have normal, okay? And now I can just drop down an attribute wrangle and I can say set v and I will say that at v equals at n. So now in my copy to points I can now drop down a pop network and if I preview this animation we can see that the particles are flying outwards from the head. And we can go inside and maybe go to our source, go to the birth tab and let's maybe decrease this constant birth rate value a bit and turn off the guide and maybe make this last for 1 second for now and drop this value inside the live variance, set relative to channel and just divide this by 2. And I can also go to the attributes and I will just multiply the velocity maybe by a factor of 3. So now if I preview this, this is the result that we get. And maybe let's go back to birth and set this back to 5000 and increase the life expectancy maybe to 1.3, so make them last a little bit longer. Okay, so this should be fine and let's add a pop force node and I'll set the amplitude for this to be maybe, let's go with 10 and this will be fine for now, so I will copy this by holding Alt and for this copy I will simply set the swirl size to be 5. Okay, so we have a small noise and a big noise. And I can preview this. So this is pretty fine for now, but we need to add some air resistance. So I will drop down a pop drag after these nodes. And instead of just setting the same air resistance for all the particles, I will turn on use of expression and I will override this value. So this parameter is called air resist, as we can see here. So I'll type air resist and I will entirely override this value. So I will say equals and we want to generate a random value per particle. So I will say rand and in parentheses I will type at ID and I want to fit the 0 to 1 value. So I will say fit 0, 1 and I will fit this from 0, 1 to let's say 0.5 and 3 and see what this result gives us. Okay, and if I go through my camera, maybe we can decrease this resistance a bit. So maybe instead of 3, I'll type 2.5 and maybe 0.35. So we want to allow the particles to fly out a little bit more outside. Let's maybe grab both of our pop forces and set the amplitude to 15. Okay, so I think this should be fine. Most of these particles will be obscured by our smoke trail in the center anyway, so we won't be really seeing so many particles. We just want to add a little bit of extra detail with some of these sparks. So I'll go up a level and let's see how we can color these. I will drop down an attribute VOP and we will color them based on their normalized age. So inside here I can drop down a bind and I will say not age but n age. So we have to type it like this and I can plug this into a ramp parameter and I'll leave this as default because we want to use the colors for once and I'll set this ramp directly into my CD and if I go up we can now adjust the color. So we can say that right when they are born we can make them completely black and then we can make them turn a little bit more orangey and right towards the end they will be black again. So let me just adjust this ramp maybe a little bit So when they are born, I want this orange to have a slight yellow hint to it, so in the beginning of their life. And then I want this to transition to a little bit more of a reddish orange. Okay, so something like this. We could also add some variation in this color for each particle if we were to modify this NH attribute that we plug into the ramp. So I'll make some room over here, and from the ID I'll generate a random value, and I will go ahead and I will fit this 0 to 1 value, so drop down a fit range, and I will fit this from negative 0.3 to 0.3. So I can grab these nodes and I can subtract this random value from our NH. So if I drop down a subtract and plug this in, we just add a little bit more variation with the color this way. So I'll go up and this should be fine for color. So I'll rename this to set CD. And we also want to randomize the particle scale of this. So I'll drop down an attribute randomize node. And for the attribute name, this will be p-scale, and for distribution I'll set this to custom ramp, and I will turn on fit value, so fit value 0 to, let's say, 0.3. Drop down this curve and maybe edit this a little bit. So we want most of these particles to have a value of 0.3, so like 80% of them will have this 0.3 value, and then this 20% will ramp up to a value of 1. So we want most of them to be small and only a few of them to be rather large. And I'll drop down a null, and so this becomes sparks. And I can go ahead and grab this node, so copy this, Control C, go up, and we will render this in a separate node, so drop down a geonode, and I'll rename this to sparks, and go inside and just object merge our sparks over here. Okay, so now I can assign a different render material for this. Let's go to our material, and I will simply create a principal shader. So drop down a principal shader, and this can be sparks. And for the principal shader, let's turn off the albedo multiplier. So we will turn all of these settings off, and we just want to use this emission intensity. And I will set this to use the point color, and maybe start with an emission intensity of 3. And go to my object and let's assign this material. So go to render and select from our mats the sparks material. And also maybe go to geometry and let's start with a point scale of 0.1. Go to my camera and let's also create a new mantra node for this. So render this separately. So go to the out network view and drop down a new mantra node. And this can become sparks. And right away over here, one important thing that you will have to set is enable the deep output. So we want to render the deep information for this sparks path as well, because then we can combine it with our main volume render in Nuke. So just make sure that the resolver is set to deep camera map. And let's go to rendering and set the pixel sample again to 9 and 9. And also point to our camera in the scenes. So I'll grab this cam_1. And render engine will be again physically based rendering, and for this we also want to allow motion blur. So turn this option on, and I want to set the shutter offset to maybe 0.5. So this will only give our particles half of the motion blur that they should have if it were physically correct. And the reason being is because we will be also adding some of our own motion blur as a post-process effect later in Nuke. So we don't really need a heavy amount of motion blur. And for this allow motion blur effect to work, we have to go to our object and our geometry node and go to sampling and set the geometry velocity blur to velocity blur. And I can go to my render view and select our sparks node and render. Okay, so here we can see it, and we can see we have motion blur as well. And maybe let's increase the p-scale value to 0.02. Okay, so now it looks slightly as it should. And I think this will be fine. We will have to see when we comp everything in Nuke, but you can see that this render took only 4 seconds. So if we're not really happy with how this looks when everything is animated, we can really go back and just re-render the whole thing, and it would only take like a few minutes. So I will go to my mantra node and we can set up the folder. So I named this sparks.$f.exr. And also make sure that you export the deep output as well. So go to the deep output and I will copy all of this, paste it here, and just add a sparks deep for my folder. And for my file name, I will say sparksdeep.$f.exr, and I can go ahead, select the whole frame range and render to disk.